Hi and welcome to another gaming video, and in today's video I want to talk about how poor the custom firmware is on a PlayStation Vita. Now that's a bit of a broad and bit of a horrible statement to make, because running custom firmware on your PS Vita is fantastic. It opens up a whole new world of things you can do on this superb handheld from Sony, but it's not without its problems. So up until about a year ago, installing custom firmware was a little bit tricky, quite a few steps. Now there is a new online method. You simply just go to this website and it does it pretty much for you, and then you go and install things like Vita Shell and YAMT, but it's fairly straightforward, and then it does open up your console to do lots of other things. So you can play games that are loaded onto an SD card. So you've got the whole Vita to SD or SD to Vita by putting a micro SD card in this adapter, and with the custom firmware on there you can then negate the fact that Sony made a very small and very expensive memory card. So this is an official memory card from Sony. I've got an 8 gig which I don't use, but it is in my Vita, but my SD to Vita has got 128 gig micro SD card in it. So you can see, I think the biggest official memory card that you can get from Sony is a 64 gig, but they are horrendously expensive and very prone to having problems. So I use this, it just sits in there. I don't actually think I even use it, it's just in there so I don't lose it. So installing custom firmware then gives you the option to use this adapter and vastly increase the capacity of your Vita. So you can then load games directly onto the memory card. You can then also use lots of homebrew games and homebrew apps, which I have a huge selection of. Anything from ports of Quake and Quake 2, original Doom, there is a Doom 2016 kind of remake. The one that I was trying to get to run this morning and kind of sparked this video off, there is a port and a very early version of Doom 3 for the Vita, but I couldn't get it to run, and it's not the first time I've run into it. Like I said, I've run custom firmware on lots of other consoles and it's fairly straightforward, but the Vita is the one that generally comes up with a lot of issues from me. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to run Doom 3. This is the Doom 3 port that I was trying to get to work, and as soon as you run it, you will get an error message at some point. There you go. And it's not the first time I've had an error message, various different ones, and it is due to the custom firmware. It's due to the way that the whole Vita system is set up. It relies on plugins and it relies on different things, and then you get some plugins that work with a few games, but you'll need a different plugin for other games, and then sometimes those plugins will conflict with each other, so the game that you had running originally then stops working. And trying to get an answer, and a solid answer, out of either the internet or even the very helpful Vita mod groups on Facebook, it's a nightmare. And sometimes it could be down to a corrupt SD card, which happens a lot on Vitas. Just don't think that the micro SD cards, any that you buy, are really quite capable of putting up with the punishment that people who have modded Vitas like to throw at it. And there's so much with Vita custom firmware that is not straightforward. I've had DSIs and I've had 3DSs, and you mod them and they run absolutely flawlessly. I've never had an error message on a DSI or a 3DS or even on a PSP, which once again, it's a Sony product, but the custom firmware on it is quite solid. For the Vita, I don't know whether it is the developers of the custom firmware or whether it is just because it's a Sony console, and Sony do like to make things very difficult for, for everyone. So I do like having custom firmware on my PlayStation Vita, but it can be such a nightmare. And when all you want to do is load a game and play it, and then you run into issues, that's when it becomes a big problem, and it can be really frustrating. This morning I thought I'm just going to check out this Doom 3 mod because I'm a big fan of Doom, and while Doom 3 is not the greatest version, to get it running on a PS Vita is a bit of a challenge and a bit of a, wow, that's great, and now I can't run it. Now, I had similar issues when I was trying to run the FIFA 22 mod. That was fairly straightforward. You just copy the game into the app folder on your SD card and it should just run. Refresh the live area in Vita Shell and it should just pick it up, but it didn't. And then it would run, and then it would give an error message, and it is a bit of a battle when trying to install and run custom games or homebrew games on a PlayStation Vita. And I've had my Vita probably about 2 or 3 months, and about 2 weeks ago I just had enough of all of the error messages popping up. And it's not just on custom games. If you download a game from the store or put a game on, then you can also run into error messages with that, and Google the error message and you'll get 15 different answers, most of which is wipe your Vita, which isn't very helpful. Sometimes it is a plugin conflict problem, but getting a definitive answer, some people say they work and then you go and try them and they don't, and you end up just giving up. And that's what I did. About a couple of weeks ago I ended up wiping my entire Vita, taking off the custom firmware, redoing it. That caused a load of issues. So if you've got a Vita and you're thinking about installing custom firmware, I highly recommend it. I had a Vita about 2 years ago and never installed custom firmware because the process at the time was fairly complicated. But now I've got this one. This is my slim model. I've installed custom firmware and I am 90% happy with it. It runs absolutely superb and it gives way more games than Sony could, than Sony offered. But it isn't without its problems, and those problems are horrendous at times, to the point of where you just feel like giving up. I've done that, like today, trying to get this Doom 3 to run. Googled some of the error message to try and get an answer, and it's, well, you need this plugin, or you need that plugin, or you need to edit the config file in your TAI folder. But none of this seemed to have worked. Try a restart, try a database rebuild, and I've just given up. Today, I am not gonna have another go at Doom 3. I'll come back to it another day. So if you've got a PlayStation Vita and you want to put custom firmware on it, I highly recommend it because of the pros of it, but there are some serious cons as well. Let me know what you think. Maybe this is just me, maybe I don't know what I'm doing, or maybe you have a Vita and it runs absolutely perfectly fine with custom firmware. I do like to sort of dig around the depths of the internet and try and find bizarre ports or things that you shouldn't really supposed to be doing on a Vita. But then if you're running custom firmware, you've probably got the same mindset. So there we go. This is a bit of a rant about how fantastic but also infuriating custom firmware on a PlayStation Vita is. Let me know what you think. Link, like, subscribe, enjoy.